Good evening, everyone, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all for joining us for this very exciting event titled To Mars, Exploring the Ancient Martian Environment with the Perseverance Rover. I have some very, very exciting experts with me today to answer all your questions, Mars and the Mars 2020 mission, and I'm excited to introduce them in a second. But before I go any further, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm your moderator for the evening, Fatima Husain. I'm the host of MIT Abstracts, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences here at MIT. And our three esteemed experts joining us today for this Q&A session are also from the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences here. So let me go ahead and share a couple of slides that I have prepared to give you all an introduction to the exciting content we are going to discuss today over the next few minutes. And here we're starting out with the Mars 2020 rover. You can see the Perseverance rover on the left hand of the screen and Jezero Crater on the right hand of the screen. The Perseverance rover is currently en route to Jezero Crater. It is currently flying over. It launched on July 30th, 2020. Many of us were able to tune in, and some folks from MIT were even actually able to travel over to the launch site and watch it. So that was very exciting. And we're expecting the rover to land around mid-February, so stay tuned for that. The Mars 2020 mission is part of Mars's exploration program, and it includes the Perseverance rover pictured on the left, and it also includes the Ingenuity helicopter drone, which is pretty exciting. The aims of this mission, which we're going to discuss in the Q&A question and answer session right after this, the aims are to investigate some astrobiologically relevant ancient environments on Mars and also investigate Mars for potential future habitability. So we're excited. We are exploring a bunch of different exciting concepts in one go with this mission. It is many, many years in the making. And here to join me today to tell you all about it and to lend their incredible expertise are three of our resident Mars experts. First, on the left hand of the screen is Professor Roger Summons. He is a professor of geobiology in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences, and he worked on the Curiosity rover as a scientist as part of the sample analysis at Mars instrument team. So please ask him all your questions related to general Mars stuff, curiosity galore. He is your go-to expert for that. In the middle of the screen is Professor Tanja Bosak. She's also a professor of geobiology in the department, and she is a co-investigator for return sample science for this specific mission. On the right-hand part of our screen is Professor Benjamin Weiss. He is a planetary scientist in our department, a professor of planetary science, and he's also a co-investigator for return sample science for the Mars 2020 mission. So you are in for a real treat tonight. These are three of the best people you could ask any of your questions. I know I've asked them a bunch of Mars questions during my time at MIT, so I'm really excited to hear from you all. And be sure to put your questions into the poll that you'll see on your screens and in the interface that you're using to currently view this presentation. Ask any and all questions. We're really excited to answer them. But while you take a moment to fill that in, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick us off by giving a question to Tanja Bosak. Hi, Tanja. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing great.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear it. So
the preparations for the landing.
Oh, I bet. So to kick us off, I was wondering if you could help us gain a little bit more orientation for this mission for those of us joining who may be interested in Mars but may not know specifics about why this mission is happening. Can you tell us a little bit about why we're focusing on Mars in the first place to look for potential past life and future habitability?
Mars is our closest planetary neighbor, and as your first slide showed, that image of the landing site, Jezero Crater, shows sedimentary rocks that tell us that there was a lake once on Mars, actually, not just one. There were multiple lakes on Mars billions of years ago. There were rivers on Mars. So we want to ask questions that not only concern life, we want to know whether life was ever possible in those lakes and rivers, but we also want to know what went wrong. why is Mars today so different from Earth? We know that our planet is habitable and teeming with life, but Mars is not. So did something go wrong? What went wrong and why? So getting a sample, as you mentioned, both Ben and I are return sample scientists on the mission. And this mission, unlike any previous mission to Mars, is planning. The major goal of the mission is to bring samples back. So we'll land in Jezero Crater and the rover can drill the rocks and prepare a cache of samples from a known geologic context. So we have some meteorites from Mars, but this would be the first time, if we can bring these samples to Earth, to have samples from a very known geologic context. So we'll know what rocks they come from, we will know the surroundings, and then we can study them.
That's super exciting. I can't wait to have Mars samples back on Earth with some intentionality. Now, I have a question to ask Ben, our planetary science expert. Tanja, you referenced this a little bit in your answer. But so Ben, I've heard that there are a few similarities between this young Mars and young Earth, but how did these planets end up so incredibly different?
So today, yeah, they're very different, as you mentioned. Surface pressures on Mars are only like 1% of the Earth's atmospheric pressure, and average surface temperatures at sort of mid latitudes are well below zero, like -70°C, typically for much of the planet. And so even so, the surface is so cold that water rarely gets above the freezing temperature. And even if it did, it would go straight from ice to gas because the surface pressure is so low. And yet, when we look at the surface of Mars, we see superimposed on kind of a background of impact craters that have been accumulating over billions of years, what look like ancient dry river channels that have degraded and flowed over these craters and actually filled some of them up with sediment, like what we see at Jezero Crater. And but, you know, by counting the number of craters as a function of the surface area, we can figure out roughly when this period of apparently warmer and wetter and thicker atmosphere occurred. And it looks like it was, say, before about 3.8 billion years ago, or 3.6 billion years ago. So clearly, the surface pressure was much higher back then. And we don't know whether these were just rivers flowing on the surface unexposed or whether they were covered by ice. But clearly something fundamentally changed in Martian history compared to the Earth, and they took very different paths. So the leading idea is that Mars lost what was once a thick early atmosphere that maintained its temperature and climate conditions. And one of the big questions for Mars 2020 and ultimately that we'll be using the return samples to investigate is, why did Mars apparently lose this thick atmosphere and transition from what were once warm and wet and possibly habitable conditions to the current cold and dry state?
And so if I understand this correctly, Ben, so tell me if I'm wrong here. These kinds of ancient Martian environments, so you're talking about potentially these ice, covered rivers or this flowing water on the surface when that was still possible. We have analogs to those kinds of environments on Earth today, right?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that you could think of this as like a subglacial environment. In fact, people have identified what look to be putative, like glacial landforms on Mars. So it does seem that, like, if you could, in detail, there are differences, and actually, again, we don't quite understand what's going on. But for example, the Martian river networks tend to be like have fewer branches, and it's not clear that there was like substantial long-term rainfall over the surface, or whether it was, a lot of the flow was dominated by groundwater that was erupting at locations on the surface. Unlike the Earth, of course, which is, its hydrologic cycle on the surface is dominated by rainfall.
Of course, it definitely feels like it's dominated by rainfall more than Cambridge. So I've been feeling.
Everyone's been at MIT for a few years knows that.
For sure. So now I want to turn to Roger and kind of ask about how does the Mars 2020 mission complement the other Mars missions, and what sort of information are you most excited about gaining this time around versus in the previous missions?
Yeah, hi everyone. Well, I've been interested in Mars exploration since the early 70s when I was a postdoc at Stanford, and my advisor at the time, or one of my advisors, was Josh Lederberg, who was an investigator on the Viking missions. And the Viking missions set out to, as light, well, one of their main objectives were life detection missions. And even though all the experiments worked perfectly and as designed, there was really no answer because of conditions that they couldn't anticipate on Mars. And so life detection has been the prime, I think, driver for exploring Mars, because it's the planet most likely to have had life, and that planet that's accessible to us. But the other thing is that Mars has rocks that are older than any rocks that we have on the Earth, and we have no record of life's origin on Earth. And we have no record of the earliest life on Earth, simply because those rocks have been destroyed. And so the ability to collect rocks from Jezero Crater, which are older than anything that we have intact on the Earth, allows us to consider the conditions under which life evolved, but also potentially the oldest life that we might be able to learn about.
Oh, wow. That's super cool. And so in a sense, like there's things on Mars that are essentially frozen in time for us, whereas we would have seen a lot of turnover here on Earth.
Exactly, because we've got tectonics on Earth, and tectonics is about recycling rocks, and all the oldest rocks on Earth have been recycled. We have some minerals dating from that early time, but nothing intact that would preserve any signatures of early life.
And so oh, go ahead, Roger.
No, you go.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, this mission is a little bit different than the Curiosity mission. I was wondering if you could highlight some of the differences between the work you've done on Curiosity and the type of work that the scientists are going to do on Mars 2020.
I'm a chemist, an organic chemist, and I'm one of those people that believes that the most convincing evidence that we'll ever obtain about potential life on Mars is molecular. Molecules that could be only made by biological processes. And we have all sorts of other potential fossils, but there'll always be arguments about whether or not they really represent biology. But I think there are aspects to molecules, DNA would be the classic, right? That you could never deny were made by a biological process. And we had an ability on Curiosity to detect organic molecules, but so far everything that's been detected is a molecule that could have had an alternative origin, a non-biological origin. And the ability to bring samples back changes all of that, because it increases the sensitivity, increases the specificity of our detections. It's going to be far more convincing, one way or the other. We're either going to know that there was life on Mars at one time or other, or we're going to be pretty confident that there was never life on Mars.
Got it. Wow, that's super exciting. We actually have a couple of audience questions that have come in, and Tanja, I think you may be the expert for this. How firm is the data that indicates lakes and rivers used to exist on Mars? How are we sure about that?
We are sure because the sediments that you showed in the first picture, that is a delta. And there is just no way that is residing in this crater, that the only way to make that landform that we can see from space is to have water flowing into a standing body of water and delivering sediments. There are lobes, there are shifting veins. So just from the shape of the rocks, we can say there was water and there was a lake. And on top of that, if one looks at those colors on the picture that you showed, they're not real. They just indicate the distributions of minerals that we can detect from space using spectroscopy. And some of those minerals contain quite a bit of water.
I see. So I pulled up that image right now that you're mentioning. So of course, Mars isn't these colors, as you said, this is false coloring. What sort of minerals here would indicate the presence of water to us? Or could you point out the colors so that we can kind of orient ourselves?
Yes, so some of these purples and blues have a lot of hydrated clay minerals, and clay minerals are the minerals that are formed because water interacts with rocks, and then some of that water gets incorporated into the new minerals, which are clay minerals. which are typically found in deltas. And then some of these greens point to carbonate rocks, which are really exciting. One of the major reasons why this landing site was chosen, and some of these carbonate minerals turn out to also contain some water in them. And so it all seems to resonate. We see from just the morphology, the shapes of these rocks, that there was a standing body of water. We also see minerals that one would expect in a delta.
Got it.
If
Okay.
that delta were to be produced on Mars, because Mars minerals are somewhat different, or Mars just concentrates different kinds of minerals.
Got it. Okay. And now I have a question for Ben. You know, we were speaking about the evolution of Mars as a planet and how it's changed over time. Other than this mission, which is absolutely super exciting, how else are we currently studying and trying to answer questions about how Mars got to where it is today?
Well, we have anticipation of the return samples. We've actually been analyzing what are now known to be over 100 rocks from Mars that were naturally transferred as meteorites from the surface of Mars to Earth. So an asteroid hit the surface of Mars, blasted off some material, and wandered around space until some of it landed on the Earth. And most of these rocks are much younger than what we'll be encountering with the Perseverance, the Mars 2020 rover. Maybe 2 of the 100 are actually as old as what we're going to see there. And by the way, the previous rover missions, as game-changing as they've been, none of them have visited terrains this old. So this is kind of picking up what Roger was saying, you know, really to get at the time when we think, at least on Earth, life likely originated. You know, this is the first Mars mission that's really going to get to the time back, equivalent time on Mars, essentially. So we do have this limited selection of Martian meteorites. And one thing that we have learned from them is that ancient Mars likely had a magnetic field. So we can see that some of these rocks are magnetized. They formed in the presence of a magnetic field, even though Mars does not have a magnetic field globally like the Earth does today, you know, generated in its core. So looks like at least about 4 billion years ago it did. And that's really interesting because one of the leading ideas for how Mars lost its atmosphere is that it was once protected by a strong magnetic field, which would otherwise, what it does is it stands off the solar wind, which is this hypervelocity plasma, you know, radiating from the sun in all directions, full of energy, and that can strip off atmospheres. So it may be that when this magnetic field died, which was sometime between roughly 4 billion years ago and today, that led to the atmospheric loss. So one of the key return sample science goals, which of course we're going to focus on more in the next session, is to see, by looking at magnetization in these return samples, get a good timing of when the magnetic field died and how strong it was in its early history to test this idea. So the Martian meteorites in general have been a spectacular archive of Martian geologic records. They've been, you know, there was one famous one that a group had suggested might have fossils in it. That was highly debated, and ultimately I think the consensus of the community is that it's not compelling evidence. But, you know, that one thing that rock was lacking was geologic context. So what we're going to get here with returning samples from Mars is we're going to know where they came from, and we're going to see the rocks around them in the geologic setting in which they formed. That's going to be extremely powerful piece of evidence for understanding these questions.
Wow, that's going to be absolutely mind-blowing, considering that you're only looking at, you know, a couple of those that are of these ages, and you know, hopefully we're going to get a lot more within, you know, the next few years. So you know, we unfortunately have to wrap up. This really flew by, but we have another question for Roger here. You know, if there is molecular evidence of life, any thoughts as to what processes might have created that life?
Well, key question, isn't it? and the processes would have to be totally analogous to those that led to formation of life on Earth. That is the chemical evolution, molecules becoming more complex by reacting with each other, establishment of very simple molecular networks, but the development of catalysis where the molecules that are being made are able to catalyze their own synthesis. I think that's the theory that we're working on at the moment, we think that's the most robust explanation for how life evolved. And yeah, to be able to sample prebiotic molecules, like an assemblage of compounds that potentially exist on Mars, similar to those that might have existed on the early Earth, is going to add significantly to our understanding of life's evolution. Here and elsewhere.
Oh, of course, of course. Actually, we do have time for one more question that I wanted to ask Tanja. One of our audience members is wondering, how do we know how old these rocks are on Mars in the first place?
So what we do, as Ben mentioned, we count craters. And the more craters in a terrain, in a region of Mars, the older the surface, because just more time has passed, and given there has been enough time for all these craters to form. And that is, this is where samples actually come to play, because we have samples from the moon, the surface of which is also heavily cratered. And those samples, because they were brought to Earth and analyzed in labs on Earth, people were able to date those particular samples and develop a metric, develop a time scale. And so the cratering statistics from the moon are translated to Mars. And this is one of the major goals for the mission, to bring samples that can actually establish the timeline for Mars itself, not something that is indirect, but very direct.
Wow. Okay, that's super cool. And I'm assuming that, this also helps calibrate any other planetary material going forward for our solar system as well, because now we'll have the moon and Mars and that. So that's super cool. So it blows my mind. So we've gotten quite a few questions from the audience that have a lot to do with sample return. So as we wrap up this session, I want to encourage everyone to hop on to the next one with us, where we discuss what happens when we're bringing samples back. It's called And Back, Mechanisms for Bringing Mars to Earth. So go ahead on Pathobalt and click it and join us there, and we'll try to answer all your burning sample return questions there. And in the meantime, I want to thank our amazing experts for their insights today, and I'm excited to see you again in approximately 2 minutes to ask you more questions. So thank you.
Thank you.